next segment is about composing Africa. Stereotypes about Africa are built on greed and deception, but they are often mistaken for truth. Music has been a strategic means of promoting stereotypes and imposing political power. As far as musical racism and musical power, early accounts of explorers and missionaries portrayed African instruments as primitive and music as cacophonous, simplistic, raucous, or out of tune. These were the antithesis of European values and ideals. Stereotypes about African music helped define people's ideas about Africa in general, and many of these stereotypes persist to the present. It is a false notion, for example, that African music is predominantly rhythmic, lacks harmony or melody or sophistication. Another false stereotype is that Africans are innately musical, that the African populations easily learned and embellished missionary and colonial music in the past. This fed into a broader stereotype about how Africans had creative and athletic abilities but lacked capacity for advanced intellectual activity. Music was also used to exert power over African populations. Missionary songs were used to indoctrinate Africans. They also demeaned and outlawed indigenous cultural practices. The national anthems and patriotic songs from colonial governments imposed and enforced allegiance as well. We also learn in this chapter about 3 different musical Africas. This is our Western popular culture creations. Many different Africas are images of Africa, such as cartoons, films, video games, audio recordings, or books. These images shape people's perception, especially as African writers and artists cannot represent themselves to these audiences. And there are several recurring themes or images. So the first theme or first image of Africa is what is called, unfortunately, Ooga Booga Africa. This stuff makes me just sick to say. I apologize. Film music composers used the term Ooga Booga music for the small stock of musical tropes they used to depict any place with brown or black-skinned natives. This was a racist caricature of chaotic, vicious, simplistic noise, thunderous drumming, and out-of-tune singing, and lacked anything of the harmonic, melodic, rhythmic, timbral, stylistic nuances of any actual African musical tradition. This caricature shaped generations of viewers' perceptions about African music. Ooga Booga Africa sought to evoke fear, disgust, pity, and/or astonishment, and this applied to Native Americans in film as well. Some examples from the book are Tarzan the Ape Man from 1932 and Tarzan Meets His Mate from 1934. In these films, African music is loud drumming or unaccompanied singing, and deemed unpleasant by the civilized European characters as they commit theft and coercion. The second image of Africa, which I already mentioned, is this Lion King Africa, referring to the Disney film from 1994 that features an Africa with no people, only animals. This appropriates certain sonic elements of African music, and many fans of the film equate this kind of soundtrack with African music. But in reality, the soundtrack was written by a German composer named Hans Zimmer, with songs by Elton John and Tim Rice, who are both British. There was a very limited contribution from a South African producer, Lebohang Morake. And this soundtrack, which was supposedly evoking the sounds of Africa, but written by German and British people, won Academy Awards, Grammys, Golden Globes, and was the best-selling soundtrack to an animated film in the United States. The film's animals combine Zulu words, which is a Southern African language, and Kiswahili names and words, which are from Eastern and Central Africa. But that's sort of the extent of it. The third stereotype is Band-Aid Africa. Africa is a land of endless suffering where Westerners can and should help. Musical projects were put forth starting in the 80s to aid Africa. It was a 1984 Band-Aid project. It was a song, Do They Know It's Christmas? It was a fundraiser for anti-famine efforts in Ethiopia. That song describes, quote unquote, Africa, not specifically Ethiopia or any provinces in Ethiopia, as a wasteland. Many of the references in the song are completely inaccurate. Africa has many abundant agricultural regions, for example, but millions of Western listeners accepted this image. The 1984 Band-Aid project raised $174 million and reinforced the stereotype of Africa as starving and helpless. But they actually ended up supporting a dictator's regime and extended the conflict in Ethiopia by possibly almost 2 years as a result of this fundraising. This impeded Ethiopia's eventual transition from dictatorship to self-governance. Now let's turn to African music and defining African music. The author summarizes some of the ways in which scholars have defined and debated the meaning of African music. In the chapter, we learn about the politics of choosing styles or artists for inclusion. There are common perceptions that Paul Simon's Graceland is African music, and yet albums by Congo composer and pianist Ray Lima are often described as not really African.